I'm also very pleased because we are here to also launch the Center for Development Economics and Policy, a new center at SIPA that has been some years in the making. And a special congratulations go to Professors Erik Verhoogen and Kiki Pop-Elekes, the director and associate director of this new center, and all of the faculty that are associated with it. I think an important goal of the Center for Development Economics and Policy is to study and address ways that contribute to the reduction of poverty in the developing world. This is absolutely consistent with SIPA's mission. It's also an area of great interest to SIPA students. And just one example of this is the recent growth of our concentration at SIPA, curricular concentration on economic and political development, which is one of the largest and most robust concentrations at our school. In recent years, SIPA has worked to build upon an already strong faculty in development economics, welcoming Supreet Kaur, Suresh Naidu, Chris Bleitman, and supported by leading faculty such as our own director of the Center for Global Economic Governance, who is collaborating for this event today, Professor Jan Svejnar. These scholars complement long-standing tenured faculty like Miguel Urquiolo, Professor Pop-Elekes and Verhoogen, and Douglas Almond, in addition to Jeff Sachs and Jose Antonio Ocampo, who is with us as well today. So in a word, this is a dream team, and we're very fortunate to have these many faculty focusing on this important area at SIPA. So I think it's fitting to formalize SIPA's commitment to the field and to establish a research center that can both promote research and contribute to training students in development economics at SIPA and Columbia more broadly. It's a field that places the practical issues of formulating policy and developing effective interventions at the center of the intellectual inquiry. And in this sense, it is particularly well placed to be at a school of public policy. So SIPA, I think, is poised to be really a world leader in this important area. I'm expecting that the center will raise the profile of this group as a whole, the strength of SIPA as a global hub for new thinking in development economics and policy. So with that, let me thank you all for coming. I look forward to hearing more about the center from Professor Verhoogen. Thank you very much, Erik.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks everyone for coming. I don't want to detract from the main event here, which is Dr. Kaushik Basu's talk, but I would like to say two things. One is to thank a number of people who have made the center possible, and then tell you a little bit about the intellectual substance of the center. So among the many people who have supported the center and have made it possible, I have to list Provost John Coatsworth, Dean Janow, whose support has been unflinching. Also, former acting Dean Rob Lieberman, whose support was important at the beginning stages. Vice Dean Miguel Urquiola, who's here, who has been a partner in crime, also from the beginning. Jan Svejnar, with whom we look forward to a long and fruitful collaboration, who's also made it possible to share the stage here today. Jessie Gale, she's here, Associate Dean of Communications. Phoebe Ford, who is responsible for the website. I don't know if they're here. Also, Program Associate Frank Mamo, who's here someplace, who's been working tirelessly and going much beyond his job description in organizing this event and getting the website ready. I was thinking as I was preparing these comments that if the Obama healthcare team called me up and asked for advice on the website, I'd have names to recommend. That hasn't happened. I don't expect it to happen, but I'm prepared just in case. Also, Dan McIntyre, who's Associate Dean of SIPA, and Joe Chartier have been providing very important logistical support for the sort of unglamorous logistical support for the center. Also, David Coughlin, who's here, and Geraldine McAllister, who are on the staff of the Center on Global Economic Governance, and last but not least, my associate director, Kiki Papelikas, who is not taking the stage, although he was invited to. But in any case, he has been working closely with me on all aspects of the center. Okay, so moving on to the let me say a few words about the intellectual substance. So the mission of the center, as the dean specified, is to support research on reducing poverty in the developing world. So this motivation differs to some extent from the typical motivation in economics, in the economics profession, which is it's explicitly normative. We are trying to change the world. It's very much in line with the mission of SIPA, but it does somewhat distinguish us from the rest of economics. At the same time, I'd say we recognize that many well-meaning policies have unintended consequences, unintended negative consequences, and so we feel it's very important that basically that understanding precede action. That in order to change the world, we have to understand it, and so. And in that light, research is extremely important. So we see ourselves as a research organization trying to inform practical interventions to reduce poverty. Okay, so the problems of development are too large for the mind to apprehend all at once, so we have to start someplace. We are beginning with two focus areas, two core initiatives, we call them. One is the Human Capital Initiative, which is led by Kiki Papelikas, which is focusing on the productive potential embodied in people that people bring to economic markets. So that would be their skills, their health, other capabilities. Especially in developing countries, this is one of the main assets that people own. And so the key questions for this initiative are: one, what are the factors that shape how individuals accumulate human capital, how much they decide to invest in human capital, and also what are the factors that restrict those investments, and then what are the consequences of those investments for various sorts of economic outcomes, both at the individual level, their wages or incomes or economic returns, and also at an aggregate level, at how human capital matters for growth. Okay. The second initiative is called the Firms and Innovation Initiative. It's motivated by the view that one of the best anti-poverty programs is a steady job, offering safe working conditions and a wage that is sufficient to support the basic needs of a household. Those sorts of jobs are more likely to be available when industrial sectors are thriving, when firms are innovating, when they're upgrading to more and more technologically sophisticated, more capital-intensive types of products. And so then the question there becomes, what are the factors? Why is it that some regions have more innovative and upgrading firms, and some not? And what role can governments play in bringing about that sort of industrial development? Okay, so those are the key questions. Concretely, the center is going to sponsor a weekly development series. It's going to fund promising student research. I'm happy to see many of the students here in the audience who are already sort of part of CDEP, and will raise the visibility of faculty research also in these areas. So I invite you to go, if you type in Google, you type in CDEP in Columbia, you'll find our website, and there's more information there. So thanks very much, and let me, without further ado, pass the floor to Jan Svejnar.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Merit. So it's a pleasure. Let me welcome you on behalf of the Center on Global Economic Governance. As you can see, two centers coming together in a highly complementary way, and it's, one couldn't think of a better way to celebrate the launch of CDEP than having Professor Kaushik Basu. As you can see, he is the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank. For those of you who are not familiar with how the World Bank works, that means he is the most powerful brain in the institution, and indeed he is. He is a person who really is an ideal economist, ideal development economist. He grew up, got his basic formation education in India, studied in England, has lectured at all the world universities that you can imagine. For quite a while, he now has been and communism is long gone, but he's a Karl Marx professor of economics at Cornell. Now, there's a little twist to it. It's M-A-R-K-S, right? So it's a family from New York City, actually, that donated money. But for the longest time, I was also on the faculty preceding Kaushik, actually. I'm not that much older, but I preceded him at Cornell. And so we always were sort of enjoying the fact that we had a Karl Marx professorship at an institution like that. Anyway, Kaushik has worked on many, many areas of economics. He has produced both theoretical, applied pieces of work, and he is unique among economists, and that's why I've always been assigning his writings as readings, in that he writes very well too. So that's on top of everything else. So it's been a pleasure actually to always both talk to him, work with him, and assign his work to others. So we're very pleased to have him here. He's been now on the job for a year and a little bit, year and a month, and is forging major changes, exciting things at the World Bank. He is the leading economic intellectual there. So it's really a pleasure and honor for us to have him on this day here to share with us his views, experiences, and vision for the future. Kaushik, the floor is yours.
Dean Janow, Eric, Kiki, Jan, distinguished members of the audience. Greatly honored to be here. Let me right away at the start tell you there's another difference with the Karl Marx. The Karl is also spelled differently, incidentally. It's C-A-R-L. However, I come from a city which had a communist government for 30 years, Calcutta. And in my native language, the spelling difference, there's no way of showing up the spelling difference. Karl Marx is spelled in exactly one way. And it gave me quite a bit of cachet, I think, coming from the United States as Karl Marx professor. It helped quite a bit. Thank you very much. Actually, I'm sort of doubly pleased to be here. Jan is a friend from years ago. I'm thankful for the invitation from the Center for Global Economic Governance. And I'm also very pleased that my visit here coincides with the launch of the Center for Development Economics and Policy. As I was telling Eric and Kiki earlier at lunch, I actually founded about half of that center in Delhi School of Economics. I founded a center called the Center for Development Economics. The policy part was not there that time. I used to be just a professor with interest in nothing but research. If I was doing it today, actually, I would have pinched this title for the center. So to be here on this occasion is just very nice for me. Thank you very much once again. Now, for my talk today, I'm going to give you a bit of a combination of the kind of work that is going on at the World Bank, which is actually very close to what I just heard. The work that is going on in the World Bank in terms of our targets, and also some of my somewhat disparate hands-on policy experience from India, and the relationship between the world of economic theory and research and the world of policy interests me greatly. So it'll be a bit of a scattered talk, but I want to take you over this entire ground. It reminds me of Galbraith in the preface to one of his books with 6 essays, says that the only common thread running through this book is that each chapter is written by the same author. A bit of a risk of that, but I'm going to take you through that nevertheless. So the World Bank, about 8 months ago, formally adopted 2 sort of mission goals. I joined the World Bank 1 year, 1 month ago, and this was in the middle of this very, very vibrant discussion that was going on about what should be the World Bank's mission goals. What is it that the World Bank is trying to achieve? And I think I played a bit of a role in the second one. The first one was already beginning to solidify, but in both these, I was very much a part of this discussion. Very briefly, what these 2 targets are, and I will tell you much more, the criticisms, and then I want to go into the interface between targets and policy. The first target is, the World Bank had been doing a lot of work on poverty, defined as daily consumption per person less than $1.25, purchasing power parity corrected, per day. Now, the discussion was that do we just say that we are going to try to bring this down? But we felt that we are now at a stage of history where we can declare an end to this kind of extreme poverty. There are other kinds that we should continue to battle, but which will not come to an end. But this one, by 2030, to be brought to an end is possible. And we were being realistic that even this will not quite be zero in the world, because there will be wars, there will be political troubles, natural disasters, so there'll be some frictional unemployment. But what is today at roughly close to 18% of the world population, today meaning 2010, the last year for which we have proper data, roughly 18% of the world population, we want to bring it down to less than 3% by the 2030. The second goal or target, there was a lot of discussion about whether it should be focused on growth or inequality. And there were virtually two schools. And we tried to bring the two schools together. And I do feel it's a bit ham-handed and simple, but I'll say a few things about targets in big organizations. We wanted to keep it very, very simple. We decided that what the second target is, we call it shared prosperity, that the World Bank is going to pay attention to the growth of the per capita income of the bottom 40% of every population. What does this mean? How does this relate to other targets, etc.? I will come to this. Targets. In academics, we typically don't get into work by saying that these are the targets. You may set a few personal targets for yourself, but not for a university or an organization. So it did feel a bit strange in the World Bank coming in and trying to say what will be our targets. But you realize once you're in a huge amorphous organization like the World Bank, it is important to specify a target. You know, if you are running an investment bank, the target is pretty well known among everyone, what you're trying to maximize. In fact, you occasionally have to tell people that don't be totally single-minded about that maximization. There are other important corporate responsibilities in life, pay some attention to it, but the target is pretty clear. But for an organization like the World Bank or a UN, it's not clear, and that can lead to a dissipation of energy and policies being crafted without adequate attention to what your ultimate aims happen to be. In a trivial way, I realized the importance of target, personal experience many years ago. I had read somewhere when at Cornell that for every 10 minutes of jogging that you do, your life expectancy goes up by 8 minutes. You know, it didn't look too bad. I mean, every 10 minutes of jogging and 8 minutes more of living on Earth seemed like a good thing. And I took to jogging regularly. Then one day, while jogging, I was asking myself, what is it that I'm trying to maximize in life? Is it the total amount of time I spend on Earth or total amount of non-jogging time I spend on Earth? If it is the latter, you've had it. Actually, this same piece of evidence goes completely the other way around, because every time you jog for 10 minutes, you're knocking off 2 minutes of your non-jogging life on Earth. So it makes a difference as to whether you jog or not, and I've vacillated since then. I jog occasionally and don't jog occasionally. But it makes a difference. It does not make a difference to every single decision that you're taking, but for some of them it can. And in an organization like the World Bank, it was important. Now, let me come into some of the criticisms that we had to face, and these are criticisms that will arise in your head. $1.25 a day is shockingly low. And purchasing power parity corrected, which means in a country like India, it'll be 40 cents per person per day. Most of us would not even know people like this, and we were getting a lot of criticism. Aren't you being too unambitious, setting it so low? Correct, at one level. But once you pause to think of the number of people who live at that shockingly low, below that shockingly low poverty line, more than 1 billion people on Earth, so 1/7 of the population, means that there is a lot still to do on that very, very modest target. There is a lot to be done. And at one level, it is a shame and a blot on Earth today that with so much prosperity, so much growth, you have so many people there. And this is not to say that we don't go for other targets and other things. When we measure poverty in Latin America, we would very often also look at below $4 a day. Latin America has become better off. So you do vary this. But for the world as a whole, we want to bring this below $1.25 a day to an end. There was one more criticism that was coming up, which is quite important for us, is that, you know, once an organization like this sets up a global target, attention could then be concentrated on the few big countries, and you can begin to ignore a lot of the sub-Saharan African small countries, but focus on the big countries. Yes, Nigeria would come up, India would come up, Indonesia, China. You do it in a few of those properly, and you will reach your global target with these countries left out altogether. To that, our response is that we are not enshrining this in a target statement, but something like no country left behind. And you minimally say that there should be no country in the world where poverty should be more than 30% by 2030 is roughly what we have in our head. This is not enshrined formally as a target. And again, 30% seems very high, but let me tell you, whole host of countries right now with more than 50% of the population below this poverty line. And we did these calculations. If you have every country in the world grow from now till 2030 at the same rate at which they have grown over the last 20 years, then in 2030, and income distribution remaining the same, then in 2030 you will still have 17 countries with poverty above 30%. And if you do the following scenario building for the up to 2030, take every country in the world over the last 20 years, take 5 or 6 years of their best growth period, project that forward. Even with that, there will be 7 countries in the world where poverty will be above 30%, couple of them above 50%. So this is not easy, but we felt that this is a target that should come in there. The second one, to do with shared prosperity. The debate, to give you a bit of an inside view of how it was going when I joined in, there was the one growth school that was saying, look, let's have the second target simply as a growth target. You try to maximize growth. To that, my own reaction was, you don't have to remind people of the growth target. If you today visit emerging economies, newspapers are carrying every second day news of how the country is growing. The growth obsession is already there. It's an important thing. I would not really downplay that for poor countries that are trying to join in the world. And for 2.5 years, I was advising the Indian government. The country is very, very keen on growth, and this makes the news. You want that. But you don't want to write down another target as a growth target, given that it is already there. Inequality is, to me, it's important. There are people who differ, have different views on this. Economists in particular, you'll probably be in a minority if you say that you're concerned about inequality per se. I'm an economist enough to know that a certain amount of inequality in society is essential for an economy to function, for incentives to be there. But if you look at today's level of inequality, where I had done a back of the envelope calculation, a bit like what we were talking at lunchtime, the 10 richest people in the world have more income than the entire population of Ethiopia. You know, that's not a certain amount of inequality, it's a huge amount of inequality. And it is no one's fault, it's a systemic problem, but we ought to pay special attention to that. So I think inequality should get some attention, but it can be very static. If you're just thinking of taking the cake as it is and redistributing it, while we work on growth, we want to work on growth attentive to income distribution. And one way of doing that, keeping it very, very simple, is to talk in terms of the bottom 40% growth rate of the bottom 40%. 2 criticisms to this, let me point out over here. One came from a group of people saying that, well, you're not paying any attention to inequality. You're just saying maximize the growth of the bottom 40%. Why not compare the bottom 40% growth with the average growth in the country or the top 60% growth? To that, my response is, the average growth in the country, we know. I mean, this is being reported all the time, per capita income growth. Right next to that, you will have that same country's bottom 40% per capita income growth. I don't have to create a ratio out of these 2 numbers. Anyone can see that there is a bit of a message being given over here. There can be very legitimate countering. You can see some countries where growth has been very good. China, very, very clearly. India as well, which could come around and say, look, our bottom 40% is growing worse than our average, which is true for both China and India. However, our bottom 40% is growing faster than the bottom 40% of many other countries. This is something to engage in discussion. I would still turn to these countries, India and China, and say that, well, that's good. But if you do have the power to get so much growth in the country, why not think in terms of policies which will bring the bottom coming up faster? And especially in India, where we have problems of malnutrition, where we have problems of illiteracy, you do need to pay very special attention to this group, even if the overall the country is growing well. And even if the bottom 40% is growing better, than in many other parts of the world. This is something, a discussion to engage in. One more criticism which continues to come is, what about other dimensions of the bottom end? I mean, just income is a single metric. So what about multi-dimensional poverty measures and life expectancy, health, literacy? Shouldn't we have targets along those as well? Two responses to that. First of all, we overdo a little bit when we begin to think of income as unidimensional and other things as multidimensional. Income is very, very multidimensional. It's the ability to buy food, it's the ability to buy clothing, it's the ability to buy housing, a variety of things. Income is one level of aggregation of lots of dimensions right away. So income is itself multidimensional. So what people are asking for is not between a unidimensional measure and multidimensional, but they are saying make it even more multidimensional. But that takes away some of the sting, given that the current measure is also multidimensional. But to that, again, my view is that, many other dimensions in life are extremely important. And in the World Bank, we've talked about health, we've talked about education, we've talked about gender equality being written down as a target, climate change, environmental sustainability as a target. Those are all very important. To me, gender equality is extremely important. One of the things you would very often hear during this discussion is people would say we should promote gender equality because it is good economics. To that, my response is, even if it were not good economics, there are certain things which are good ends in themselves. Everything does not have to end up as good economics. We ought to push for that. So we ought to push for these, but in writing down goals, we decided we want to keep it very simple, two things, and we decided on these two. There will be research in many other areas, and I'm taking a lot of personal interest in opening up this larger research domain. A quick picture of how we've done on poverty and what the future looks like, and then I want to go into a few specific policy examples. So with that, you can just look at the bottom line, and you can see other things, of course, but concentrate on that. Now, if you want to know how we've come to where we are, I told you in 2010, there's close to 18% of the people in the world are below this shockingly low poverty line of $1.25 a day. That's the bottom right-hand corner figure, 17.64. You will see that the world has improved actually fairly dramatically. In 1980, 43% of the world population was below this poverty line. And then now we are down to something like 18%. And actually the latest numbers that we are beginning to get in, because don't take the last 1 year, but before that, over the last 2-3 years, emerging economies were doing very well. The poverty figure will be quite a bit down from 17.64 as well. It'll probably be below 16% as of today. We don't know the exact figure, but China's improved a lot. India's also improved a lot since in the last 3 years. So this is roughly the trend. The trend hides a couple of things. The big gainer was China. It was driving a lot of the global figure in the beginning. In fact, in sub-Saharan Africa, in the beginning, poverty was rising from 1980 for a while. Then it is beginning to go down. Last 10 years have been very good for sub-Saharan Africa. Now, can we make it to the target, the World Bank target, driving on growth alone? This is being discussed. This is the age-old discussion of growth versus other kinds of interventions. A lot has been written. I've got a paper which is going to go up on the World Bank website in another 2 days. But let me do one mechanical calculation for you and show you what happens. So if you take the last 10 years growth achieved by all countries in the world, and last 10 years meaning actually it's the first decade of this century, so up to 2010, and project forward the same growth. All these countries continue to grow at the same rate, hold income distribution constant, you will reach 5.5% of the world population will be poor by 2030, still far away from the target of less than 3%. And last 10 years actually have been very good for emerging economies, developing countries, low-income countries, because sub-Saharan Africa is growing. If you do this for the last 20 years growth and then project that forward, that figure 5.5 would be close to 8%. You won't get there. Now, my point is, whether or not you would get there with growth, why not use other instruments? Because this is not a target where if you say that as long as I make that target, we don't want to go faster. This is a blot on today's society that we have so much poverty. So we have to think in terms of other measures, other instruments of getting there. And here we come into very tricky problems to do with economic analysis, economic theory, and globalization. I'll give you one quick example, and then I'll talk about a couple of other things and come back directly to this exercise, which is the following kind of thing. We very often, when we run little micro programs, given that in economics there's such a division between microeconomic analysis and macroeconomic analysis, I feel occasionally we make the following mistake. Suppose in a country, you've decided that you're going to print money and give it to in targeted villages to improve nutrition standards in these villages. And you begin to do this in lots of villages in your country. Micro researchers are then sent out to see if this is benefiting the poor or not. And you go to these villages which have been targeted, you do your studies, you will probably find that people in these villages have become better off. And I can give you real examples of these kinds of interventions and these kinds of studies from the world. However, if you are printing money and doing this in these villages where you're directly getting the benefit, you'll become better off. But the act of printing and injecting money into the economy will probably cause a slight rise in prices all over the economy, which means in villages far away from these targets, where there is no intervention in injecting money, the only effect will be of a slight rise in prices. The poor people over there who are close to the poverty line will tip below the poverty line. So it's entirely possible that your micro studies will show that these interventions have been very successful in these 200 villages or 2,000 villages, but overall poverty in the country has gone up because of the unintended consequences through monetary channels and fiscal channels to other parts of the economy, causing a deterioration. This is something real. And this is where you also have to be very mindful of economics. And on this, I have to say a lot of it is very mainstream economics. I have my disagreements with a lot of mainstream economics, but there are also these kinds of things where you have to pay attention and you have to use a combination of macroeconomic sense, theory, judgment with these micro studies to know that you're getting a full benefit out of this. And since your center is going to, with your target, is going to look at, I'm glad you're making a global target as well. You should be mindful of this. Researchers tend to do this naturally, but I have to, in the World Bank, in the government of India, when I was there, I would have to always warn people that, you know, in an economic analysis, you have to match with some of these which are theoretical ideas with little bits of micro studies which you can do with very good controls nowadays, but the larger theoretical ideas you have to bring to the stage. I thought what I'm going to do is I will come back very specifically to the poverty target and globalization problem. I faced some of that while I was doing my Indian job, that you are thinking of the Indian economy and certain interventions, but something happens in the United States or in Europe, which actually triggers off global changes, which once upon a time when the world was much more balkanized, maybe you did not have to worry about that. But today, when you're making policy, you all the time have to be aware that you don't have the controls of all the important levers of policy needed for well-being in your own country, because it's an extremely interconnected world. And you know, if you're a rich industrialized country, then you're aware of one another. You're paying attention to one another. If you're a poorer country, there's much less automatic attention by the richer countries which are driving policies in their own interests. And India is not the worst case of that, because India is still a big and a reasonably powerful country. We were there in G20 participating in these discussions. Think of the many, many small countries with very little say. They are trying to run their own policy in their own country with dreadful problems of poverty. When inflation is coming out from ashore into them, the trade balance is changing, exchange rates are changing, maybe nothing to do with them. This is a reality of life, and you have to contend with that throughout in policy making. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. But I thought I'll begin with one of my first experiences as an research economist who had spent his entire life in an academic career when I went back to India in 2009. And in 2010, within the first year, by the end, I got onto a very interesting problem, and I was using all my sort of textbook theoretical knowledge. And I think I was still using it right, but I did not gauge the politics of it right. Corruption, as you know, has been a huge problem in a country like India. One particular kind of corruption, which got misunderstood when I first floated my paper, troubled me a lot. This is not the corruption that affects the big businesses, big operations, but very ordinary people. Some of my very poor relatives from Calcutta would call me up and say that, you know, for a simple thing, I'm trying to get a driving license for a son, I'm being asked for a bribe. I want to register something that I've got, I'm supposed to register, I'm being asked to pay a bribe. This is, people feel these, and I feel what we don't realize, because it's the corruption at the top end that gets all the attention. The poor people don't get access to many of their rights because of this a lot of small corruption that pervades through society. I call these corruptions harassment bribes. A harassment bribe is being asked to pay a bribe for something to which you have a right. You have a right to that, but you don't know how to handle the bureaucracy, you get stopped and you get asked for a bribe. Incidentally, this can also happen for big bribes. Harassment bribe is a concept which applies a lot to the poor and the small, but if you brought a huge consignment of imports into the country, completely legally, you want to clear the customs and you've been stopped and illegally asked for a bribe, that's also a harassment bribe. So big or small, but my attention was on the small ones. And India has a law. It's a 1988 Prevention of Corruption Act, which says that the bribe taker and the bribe giver should be treated on par, and the punishment is the same for both of them. And bribe giving is a dreadful, bribe giving or taking is a dreadful activity, and at first sight this seems very right, penalize the whole activity. But the more I thought about it, and that time I was working as advisor to the Indian government, it was very clear that one big problem was troubling India, that every time a bribery case comes up, you just can't get evidence of that bribery, hard evidence which the courts would need. And it's not very difficult to see what's happening. The giver and the taker both being guilty, the person who's given the bribe becomes a partner of the person who's taken a bribe once the courts get into the act. Once the courts get into the act, the two of them are conniving to keep the information away from the court that this bribery has taken place. If you change the law and said that for harassment bribes, not all bribes, that bribe giving should be treated as a legal activity. Not illegal sounds, I think, better when you're talking about bribery. Not an illegal activity. Bribe taking is illegal. You can make it doubly illegal. You take the punishment of the both. See something that happens, it's a standard game theoretic argument, that in the second period after the suspicion of a bribery, the collusion between the giver and the taker will break down altogether. Because the bribe giver now is much more easygoing, blowing the whistle and saying that I had to give a bribe, he forced me. Because otherwise I wouldn't get something which I was supposed to get. And knowing this, the bribe taker, in the first period when asking for a bribe, will be much more careful, knowing that in the second period I will not get collusion from this chap because this chap is going to tell on me. There has now been lab experiments of these kinds of contracts, and actually with, of course, reality is always never as simple. There are exceptions, but it's largely borne out. But in my naivety, I got very excited. This is going to take partial care of a big problem. I was never foolish enough to think that it's going to solve the problem. I wrote up a paper and floated it on the Ministry of Finance's website, that the Indian law should be amended, making bribe giving legal and taking doubly illegal. Furor broke out in a way that I had never anticipated. I thought it's a good idea. There will be some academic debates. Maybe the law would be amended in the end. People started, there were members of parliament who were raising questions. There were questions being directed to the Prime Minister, to the Finance Minister, that this is an insult to Indian morality, to the Constitution, etc., and I should be asked to leave the government. There were people who were asking for that. That was perhaps, I mean, I generally don't get stressed about anything, but maybe those 2-3 days I did get a bit stressed when this was happening continuously. And there was this one evening, I remember, when a very popular television channel, Barkha, that some of you will know in India, was phoning me repeatedly saying that we've got a huge group of people, why don't you come there and defend the argument? Now, you know, defending with a big group, when the television knows that the biggest mileage they can get is by just churning this up debate, is not something that you relish doing. So, well, I actually do relish doing that as well, but I was doing an important government job. I was a bit nervous churning this debate up. So that evening was an evening when I phoned up the Indian Prime Minister and asked him, I mean, this was, I had to ask him saying that, look, I know I've floated an idea. I don't know if you've seen this. I have to say that he's come under a lot of criticism of late, but this particular remark also gave me a lot of hope for India. His response to me on the phone was, he said that I don't really agree with your idea. I don't think the law ought to be amended in that way, but ideas ought to be floated and discussed. So I have no problem with the idea being there, and you should discuss. And to me, that was actually quite marvelous. And if the country can keep up this kind of openness, that's, I think, a good idea. This got picked up subsequently. I was very lucky. There were two groups of people, and this is a globalized world, one kind of globalization which helped. The Economist magazine picked this up. Le Monde had write-ups which were actually all very supportive of me. And there was another group that pleased me immensely. Indian feminists who had been arguing that in cases of dowry giving and taking should not be treated on par. It's a dreadful practice, but you have to separate out between the perpetrator of this and the victims of this. And the law cannot treat the two sides equally. Wrote some letters to me, which for me was very heartening, saying that, yes, there are dreadful things in life, but when an ordinary poor person who's got a right to something is being harassed for a bribe, you can't treat that person as guilty in the same way as the bureaucrat who's asking for that bribe. So there's no closure on this. There has been some more discussion, and I'm actually still hopeful that this very academic idea which I brought to the table will see the light of day, and there will be some change on that. Let me get into a couple of more bigger global ideas where you will see some of this which were policy making in a globalized world. Another one which was coming to me in a big way was in these G20 meetings, which I used to do a lot, representing India for the MAP process. India and Canada used to lead this, the framework working group, and I used to head the Indian team. Here, every time we got together, all the emerging countries, there would be a little bit of a corridor conversation. China, India, Indonesia, with very similar concerns that the global economies are trying to pull out of the big industrialized countries are trying to pull out of their own crisis and using big monetary and fiscal policy interventions. A lot of these actually in today's globalized world come ashore in poorer countries, emerging economies, and we have to deal with this. So you need global coordination of policy. And this is where I think multilateral organizations and even universities that do not have narrow partisan interests have a role to play in these global coordinations of policies. You know, if you think of money creation, Bank of England was set up in 1694. With one of the important things, realizations was that there is one area in life where you do not want competition. Competition is good in most things in life, but money-creating authorities, there should not be too many in a country. There should ideally be one money-creating authority. Bank of England was set up, and one money-creating authority did not happen immediately, but over the years, it moved towards that. Riksbank in Sweden was already there. Other banks came up, the US much later, but the idea is one country should have one money-creating authority because you don't want competitive money creation. But think of today's world. Increasingly, the world economy is one economy. For the world economy now, we've got lots of money-creating authorities, one per country. So the predicament that we had tried to escape from in the 17th century, we've come back to that through another mechanism. The world is a single globalized economy, close to that, and we've got lots of money-creating authorities. It's not surprising at all that in the deepest period of the crisis, you were seeing that when the US intervenes in the United States with one more round of quantitative easing, it does not do what used to happen in the olden days. Get the growth rate in the US up, inflation also up. That was not happening enough. What was happening is in emerging economies, you do get a growth shot from activities in these rich countries, but you also get an inflation shot in those countries because the money goes there. And this interdependence is huge. I mean, for me, there's a specific day when this came to roost the day United States was downgraded by S&Ps, that is early August 2011, when this happened. I remember in Delhi in the evening, my phone started ringing, and these were journalists, policymakers all coming that the major news, US has been downgraded. And in the olden days, that would be, yes, it's of some academic interest to me sitting in India making Indian policy, no more. But that evening we got together, and from the next day you saw the exchange rate moving. What was happening was clear that with the US downgrading, investors got insecure about their money all over the world, and they were pulling out money from all over the world and putting it into one place, very ironically in the beginning, where they were feeling safer, which is the US Treasury. And so it was not going to Europe. It was being pulled out from all over into the US Treasury, because the feeling was, yes, you may not earn any interest rate, but there is not going to be a default. There are some risks of that from what has happened in recent times, but the feeling then was that in the US there won't be a default. And see how the world had changed. Money was not going in the olden days, it would also go into Spain, it would go into France, it would go into Italy, knowing that there would not be default by these governments. But now something has changed in these governments. None of these governments now have access to a central bank that can print money. So if you put money in a sovereign bond in Europe, that sovereign can't get the money ready to pay you back, which in the US, at least notionally, the government can do that. And that is what caused this huge change and turmoil all over the world, including in Europe. And in India, every time we would get together, we would think in terms of policy, which would be reactive policy, because these are big countries making changes, and you can't immediately react to that. And you can't do things which are completely inward looking. You are taking account of that. And I like to hope that in today's globalized world, we are not going to, in a rush, move to one central bank for the world. And after the European experience, it'll probably take even longer. But this is a forum of policy that ought to open up along with our micro studies. I want to go back now to picking this up with one concrete example of a policy challenge domestically, and then if you are trying to eradicate poverty, what globalization does. Slightly contrived example, but I will take you through that very quickly, and 10 minutes and I will be done with that. So let me go into this little picture. Let me explain this picture. There is a bit of story behind that, which I've decided not to give explicitly. Take a society, and this will also show you that being averse to inequality, being averse to poverty, how these things can translate into slightly different policies. Take a country with two kinds of people, the skilled people and the unskilled people. And this is a reasonably fair country where the skilled people are the richer people and the unskilled people are the poorer people. It doesn't always happen that way, but this is a country where that is the case. Now, if there is, and the bottom axis is the income tax rate. In this country, let us say that the taxation is used for no other purpose but to take some money from the rich and give to the poor. If the tax rate is 0, I will assume that the poorest people, which is the blue line with the lowercase y being the income, they earn 0. You can normalize the 0 to a small number if you want, but they earn 0. And the rich people or the skilled people earn A. They earn a huge amount. Suppose you start with a policy of increasing the tax rate starting from a very low tax rate of 0. As you raise the tax rate, the after-tax income in the hands of the rich will go down. So the rich people's income is going down as your tax rate is increasing. So as the tax rate increases, rich people's income, post-tax income in hand goes down. However, there are two things which is driving their income down. The tax is literally taking away some of their money, and it is arguable that they are working a little less hard as the tax rate is going up. So two things driving it down. And for the poor, as the rich are being taxed more, since this is such a simple economy where the tax is used for nothing else but to transfer to the poor are becoming better off as the tax rate goes up. However, when the tax rate goes up a huge amount, the skilled people begin to work so little that there is less money to transfer from the rich to the poor. So that even the poor start becoming worse off. Hence, this inverted U curve for the poor people's income vis-a-vis the tax rate. It goes up and then it begins to come down. Okay, now policy questions. Suppose in this country, you're a utilitarian. You don't care about who gets what. You just want to maximize the cake. You're just obsessed about the country's total income. The best tax rate is clear, 0. You earn no tax, the poor will be abysmally poor, the rich will be super rich, the total cake will be very large. If you don't like that, and let's go over to the other extreme and say you want to minimize poverty. What will you do in this case? You'll take the bottom segment, there are just 2 kinds. You'll try to maximize their income. The poorest segment should be better off. And where will that tax rate be? And the answer is, this is the peak of the poorest people's income. So the tax rate will be 1/3 is the tax rate. I've just cooked up these numbers. But however, notice that at that tax rate of 1/3, there is still some inequality. The rich people are still richer. If your interest is not poverty reduction, but equality, you just want as much equality as possible, you'll put up the tax rate even more. You'll take it to half, where both of them have the same income. Which means in this exercise, getting to full inequality means you have to hurt the poor. The poor will have to be brought down from their peak. And I'm giving this example as a situation where I like to believe that most people will say that, no, that kind of inequality is worth it, or you don't want that kind of total equality where you'll drag people down to get to that. A reasonable solution over here is to be at this 1/3 level of taxation. Now this leads to, so this was what you would do if you were taking our shared prosperity target and trying to get the bottom 40% do as well off as possible. You're not obsessed about inequality. Inequality is a byproduct. It's not a good thing. You want to keep it a bit less than what it is. You would go for a tax rate of, in this model, and this is the model we just cooked up, it's a 33% tax rate. Okay. This has one problem, however, and this is again, you feel, if you're working, especially in an emerging economy, if you try to improve this, improve distribution and attack the problem of poverty, you begin to lose people at the top because the world is a relatively open space. This used to be there a lot in the labor standards discussion once upon a time, that if one country tries to raise its labor standards, there'll be another country that will lower the labor standards and attract labor out. So India finds it difficult to raise labor standards because it will be pulled away to China. China finds it difficult to increase labor standards because India will take advantage of that. This risk used to play out among developing countries. There is indeed, that is a genuine risk. You have that risk in terms of fiscal policy as well. As you drive towards a better distribution, attack poverty, you can get a loss of people at the top, and this can be converted into a very, very simple game. And that's my last slide. It's this one. Take 2 countries. Each country has to choose a tax rate 1/12, 1/6, 1/3. Country A also has to choose similar tax rates. Don't bother to pay too much attention to that. I'll walk you through in words. We've already seen that a single closed economy would choose a tax rate of 1/3. That's the best tax rate for it. Keep the targets of these 2 countries the same. They want their poorest people to be better off and nothing else. So they've taken the World Bank's shared prosperity target totally. But now it's a globalized world, and you will see how the policy will begin to change. In a globalized world, if starting from that 1/3 tax rate, if you lower it a little bit, you'll make your country more attractive to skilled people from other countries to come in. So you can have more people coming in, all of them paying a slightly lower tax, but you'll be able to divert that money to your poor. And for the sake of your poor, you have a reason to lower your tax rate a little bit, attract skilled people, your poor people will be better off. All countries will do that. So from 1/3, they will all move to a 1/6 tax rate. Once you've all got there, you can take another step. Lower it a little bit more. People still continue to pay virtually the same tax. Some more people come over, and your poor people become better off. If you continue to play this fiscal game across countries, and there is actually recording that in OECD countries, corporate taxes actually have gone through these kinds of phases. When you begin to compete in the market to attract more capital, this is a contrived example with income tax. you do that in this economy, the equilibrium is going to be you are going to cut the tax rate down to 1/12. And your target remains the same. You're interested in your poor people, but you're behaving very differently. Why? Because you're a global player and playing the global market. So very often people will jump to from your action to what your target is. That is not depending on whether it's a globalized world or not. Those can be very, very different. And in today's world, you have to be sensitive to this. This is a university where I don't have to repeat or say this much, but in the World Bank, I do keep repeating because when you are making policy and you're just looking at a couple of policy targets and you're working with them, that is your vision. Just focusing on that, you're trying to do your best. You very often don't look at these interdependencies that play out in today's world and which can lead to different strategies of policy making, which you have to be sensitive to in devising and structuring the policy the targets that you want to go after. So it's one thing to set down targets, which we have done. From that to policy is not an easy step. And if you blindly take up a taxation policy and begin to do that, you're going to get games of this kind being played out in the world. You have to also combine your micro studies with your macro studies. Macro studies you will never be able to do with the perfect controls that nowadays we have for micro studies. Micro studies nowadays we do these wonderful controls. You have to combine that with a lot of the gut feeling, intuition, and theory of macro policy. You have to bring this to the same table. All this is to say that these targets will not be easy targets. And some of the answers that we will get, which we feel are answers, 5 years down the road, there may be a new body of evidence which will tell you that, no, these were not quite the answers. You need another set of policies. You need to tweak the policies that you've undertaken. But that is true in science, that is true in economics, that we will never hit upon an ultimately correct set of policies. Especially in the world of finance, I feel this very strongly. Just a couple of months ago, I wrote a theory paper on manipulating exchange rates. How you can manipulate exchange rates to just fatten your own pockets at the expense of ordinary people just by making these exchange rates fluctuate. You buy and sell at the right time, and ordinary people buy and sell at the wrong time. You've moved money into your own pocket. It was a purely academic exercise, but if you've read the business newspapers over the last few days, there's charge and countercharge that is happening, that this game is happening, and that there are people who are losing out by this. This just shows that in the world of finance, and we've seen this also in mortgage markets and all, even the practice will keep evolving. People are intelligent. They are discovering new methods, new ways of intervening, which means the law, not only is there the complexity of the world, but there is going to be a continuous evolution of policy and law, because people's practices will change as they discover a new financial product, new way to intervene in the market. You will also have to think of evolution of the law to take account of that. The research agenda will remain big, and an organization and an institute like Columbia and your research institutes over here will continue to flourish, not for the right reasons, but because there will be a need for this in the world, for this kind of research to feed in to policymakers in the front line. So let me wish once again all the best to the new institute, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak here. Thank you.
We will now have time for questions and answers. We agreed that I encourage you then to go to the microphone and identify yourself and keep your questions, comments very brief so that we can get as many people participating as possible.
Sure. So I have a question about back to the shared prosperity goal, which I like very much, and I agree is very much in the spirit of our new center and my own sort of thinking about how development works. I do want to push or ask a little bit about inequality and whether inequality per se is bad. And this, I'm going to refer back to a conversation we had at lunch where Jan has some research showing that you have growth on the left-hand side of a regression, on the right-hand side you have a bunch of observable variables, anything that you have, and then you put the number of billionaires in a developing country. That turns out to be quite negatively associated with growth. which to me says something. There may be a relationship between inequality and the political economy in a country where having a few very rich people is actually very bad because they can capture the political system. And so I'm wondering whether you agree with that and whether you agree that there are costs of inequality above and beyond.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Jump in straight away. Maybe I'll be there so I can see people as I'm speaking. Yeah.
Take your water, yeah.
Okay, that also goes. If you have a question on that, we'll open that up. So I'm just separating out two parts to this. I feel the first and foremost target has to be poverty and the end of poverty. And as my example tried to show, that there are situations in life where you have to tolerate a certain inequality for that, and that I would tolerate because that's the bigger target. What Jan's result seems to suggest, and I've just got a first glimpse of that, is that very top end, and especially it depends on how one gets to that very top end, that can put a brake on some of the other better policies. So over here, your target is clear, and instrumentally, you know that a lot of inequality, especially if it is crony capitalism which leads to that, that tends to stunt a lot of general growth and therefore the well-being of the poor. And there, since I normatively take the stand that the first target has to be poverty, that's a no-brainer. The question is, if with poverty remaining the same, you can do something about inequality, should you or not? Poverty is the first target, but here's a policy where I don't even know what it will do to poverty, but it mitigates inequality a little bit. There I have to say, this is my own personal view, we should fight that inequality. Excessive inequality has the following problem as well. You know, if inequality is very large, and if for reasons of sustainability we put a cap on people's consumption, then through dynastic inheritances, inequality will continue to increase because you can't consume quite as much as you're generating an income. You're going to pass it down dynastically. Dynastically, the wealth inequality is going to grow over time because you're keeping consumption limited because of environmental reasons, which also I think is very bad for the social ethos of a country. If some people become super wealthy in terms of wealth and lots of people who are abysmally poor, I feel it's going to hurt the fabric of a life, and it's also going to make a difference in terms of power relations. So if there is a choice between battling poverty and inequality, and I do think there are situations where there is a choice where some of the radical messages make a mistake over there, you have to pause and say certain amount of inequality you have to live with. And I know also from just ordinary economic theorizing that certain amount of inequality, quite a bit of inequality, you have to live with. Otherwise, you would actually create crushing poverty through that. But beyond the point, these questions come up. And we also have to examine data, like we said, that whether it is crony capitalism which gives it, or whether other means the impact can be different, we have to be sensitive to that.
Good. So I'll ask one more question and then we'll open it up. So you gave us a really nice description of how you were thinking about the two goals, ending extreme poverty and promoting shared inequality. I'm sure that in that, with all the brain power that you have in the bank, you asked yourself, should we have two goals? Shouldn't we have three? If so, what was the third one that you've foregone? And how much of a foregoing have you made?
There were about 20 candidates for the third one. As I said, there was a lot of discussion at one stage. These were the ones which became salient. Gender as an explicit third goal, we did talk about a lot. Climate and environmental sustainability as a separate goal, we talked about a lot. But then what happened was, it was the ampleness of options which made us finally decide that, look, let us keep it to very simple, rather economistic goals as the bank's goals. But unlike a line that some people have taken, there are people even in the bank who have taken that once we've set these two goals, this is all that we are doing. We will remain very open to these other things, and at times these other goals are instrumentally important for these. Like if you want to have sustained reduction of poverty, you better be aware of climate change and the environment. Otherwise, you may get your poverty target by 2030, but it's going to spiral back up again. But at times it is not even an instrumental importance, it's of importance in itself. We've mentioned two, a lot of our work is organized around those two, but there are all these others which are very important to us.
If there are questions, please come to the microphone, briefly identify yourself and make sure the question or comment is brief. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Dan Lasaga. I'm a SIPA grad. So there's been a lot of talk about policy and theory. I have a hankering for a little bit more concrete example. If you could give me either the World Bank or in India of a policy that had promise and failed miserably, and the opposite, a policy that, well, not that looked horrible, but a policy that worked well. Thank you.
Let me, it's not quite a failure miserably, I'll have to think a bit harder, but a policy which has a negative effect which was unexpected. I'll give you one example. In India, there is a program of getting food to the poorest sections of the population. And I feel this is exactly what something a society should be concerned with. Food and kerosene and couple of basic things we try to provide to them. The mechanism that was used in India is the method of the ration shop. There are some 500,000 ration stores all over India that are meant to distribute to the poor. The way it was done was that the government acquires the food, acquires some of these fuels, oils, hands it over to the ration shops, and the ration shops are told to sell it to these people. On the food front, we have data which is now 5-6 years old, but these things don't fluctuate like stock market numbers. 44% of that food was leaking out. The government was collecting the food, trying to give it through these stores. It looked like a very good idea, and there was a lot of buy-in, but then it's easy to see once you begin to see this data coming in, what's happening. Once you give the subsidized food over to these stores and tell the stores that be good and give it to the poor people who will come with cards, the temptation of being bad is very high. You sell it off on the open market, you tell the poor people to go away, or you adulterate their food and give them adulterated food. What do you do with this kind of a fallout? So this is a very concrete example, and I can tell you it's a very heated subject. My view in India was that I don't want to get away from this responsibility of the government. There were the market fundamentalists who would say, you should get out of this altogether. Growth will ultimately reach the poor. That was not my line. The line I explicitly took is that don't try to give the subsidy through the stores into these people's hands. Give it to them directly and let them buy it at the market price from private sellers or government sellers. And the problem will be vastly diminished, and I feel completely convinced that that is the case. Another problem that was arising with some fuels, which India was giving very cheap with government subsidies through these stores, lowered price. This was crossing over our borders into the neighboring countries where this kind of a subsidy is not given. A lot of evidence that a lot of this was going. And really, if it was going to poor people across the country, I would not grudge that much. It's the subsidy. I know there's political economy of this, but if it's going to the poor, it's not that bad. But it is picked up by the middlemen who then take advantage of the price differential across these countries. But there are better policies to do this. India has just adopted a new law. And in this law, the room has been left open about how the subsidy is delivered. So there has been a change which hopefully we will see this play out. And one difficulty that arises with the civil society activists when I started talking about this in India, see, a lot of them are extremely suspicious. When you say that, look, fold back this program and start another revised one, since there are so many people who want to fold back this program and start nothing so that there's no attempt to reach the poor, they suspect you're in that camp and surreptitiously pulling this out. I was never there, but I'm glad to say that this is a very concrete example where we know what kind of a leakage was taking place, and hopefully India is going to make amends to this. I can give other examples, but it'll take too much time.
Michael Bloom, formerly of the United Nations. My question has to do with the impact of the targets which you've described here, the practical impact. As you may know, studies of the actual impact of projects previously at the World Bank have shown that many of these projects haven't reached their goals and have actually been negatively affected poor people, or the poor population. So my question is, how are those targets being rolled into the project when a project is being first proposed?
Let me try to answer. Tell me if I'm getting this wrong. This is what I was alluding to earlier. There is often a tendency to check on the impact of these targets by going to very close to the areas where these programs are being tried, and you look at what's happening overall in terms of the impact of these. We do very good studies on that, including some very good randomized trials being done to do this. But the trouble with this is that, yes, you do find out that it's done great work over there, but some of this can have fallouts in terms of overall prices going up. Something happening in the macroeconomy, which means that it's almost like being on trying to walk up an escalator that is coming down. You keep, each step is an upward step, but you're not moving up because there's something happening overall in the economy. And there is a little bit of that, and that correction will take some time. What the World Bank has now also started, this is a very new initiative. It's called the Science of Delivery, which is to check much more carefully as to the impact directly on the people on whom you're trying to do this. So don't stop one step earlier by saying, has the money been dispersed? Have the hospitals been built for the poor people? You go and see the impact directly on them. So there is work going on that, and there is work trying to marry macroeconomics for the larger impact.
Cynthia Roberts, I'm an adjunct professor here. My question follows in the line of Jan Svejnar's looking at crony capitalism, political economy, in particular related to another part of World Bank's work on the Doing Business project. Interestingly, you have some crony capitalist countries like Russia embracing the Doing Business project to a certain extent and trying to raise their standings and improve entrepreneurship, even though there's very limited rule of law. But on the other hand, you have countries, big important countries like China, trying to kill off the Doing Business project. I have a pretty good handle on what Russia's up to, but the Chinese side seems more puzzling. Clearly, their rankings are lower than they think. Is this, in your view, principally a question of the domestic politics and the debate going on over reducing the power of the major state enterprises, or is this China exercising its nationalist muscle with corporations and global governance institutions like the World Bank and their place in it? Thank you.
Cynthia, thank you very much. I'm actually in the thick of this doing business debate. Let me tell you, and actually if you have done studies or anything which sheds a little bit of light on this, do send them to me. But here is where we stand. There was a Trevor Manuel Commission that was set up, I don't know if you know. One of the things, somewhat to my dismay, I discovered that the Trevor Manuel Commission suggested that the doing business exercise should be kept up, but it should be moved over to the division of the bank which I head, which is the research and the data. So doing business is on the 15th of November, so it's round the corner. It's moving over to my part. So I'm going to be hands-on in this. The first glimpses that I've got of this is I used to use doing business in India when I was doing my job to occasionally shake up the government a little bit about the clumsy structures of people trying to get a license, people trying to close down a business, how difficult it is, and it was always very useful. Coming into the World Bank, I realized that it's so political, the debate. And part of this is simply that people are watching the end result. If you are 120th and you don't like that, and if you have the muscle, you kick up a big shindy that this is being done awfully. And I don't know the Russian side at all, but I know that this has come up from many different countries and they've taken different positions. So part of it is that. Part of it is also, there are procedural problems. So I'm hoping I will work during this year to improve the quality of doing business. Labor, for instance, which is of great interest to me, labor was not being handled correctly in this. You just don't want to increase the power of firing as a good doing business. I mean, there are two sides to this, so this has to be accounted for intelligently. What is a doing business well ethos over there? There is also a sample collection problem, which we have this acutely. Currently, the practice with doing business is you go to one city in a country to collect the information, which for Samoa is fine if you get it from one city. But when you're taking Shanghai and saying this is China and Mumbai and saying this is Bombay, this runs into a problem. So I'm into this, the politics of it and the sheer quality of the product this year full time. Thank you very much. I mean, I don't know very much the details of the political economy of this, but I've been made fully aware that I'll spend a large amount of my time this year on this.
Hi, I'm Katya Vasilaki, and I'm an Earth Institute postdoctoral fellow. My question is specific to India and a little bit about human capital accumulation and also the general equilibrium effects you were saying we need to look at as development economists. So I guess there's some debate about the general equilibrium effects of a growing educated economy in India, in the sense that there's a definite pipeline effect in terms of the young becoming more educated over time, but that the skilled jobs necessary to provide jobs to that educated class aren't sufficient. And so what will that actually do to inequality over time and to wage inequality, because there will be too many skilled for too few skilled jobs. And I guess that's a debate also in other developing country contexts, and I was interested to know your thoughts.
Sure. You know, the labor market has been fascinating in India. People say India's original takeoff in 1994. One reason it happened was India had massively overinvested in engineering skills and higher education skills. And there was a huge catchment of unemployed, overeducated people who were waiting when Silicon Valley took off. It was just a lucky break for India that, of course, no one had anticipated this, but there was this ready catchment that was there. And it's not surprising that half of the United States H-1B visa was going out to India because there was this ready catchment that India did do very well by, and India's growth is partly because of that. But India's inequality has risen steadily. Poverty has fallen, but inequality has risen, and it may well have something to do with this. To that, however, the response is you don't want to cut this down, high-skilled workers beginning to earn better, doing better, coming into the global market. You do want to pick up that, but you want to somehow make the segment that gets left behind pay greater attention to that. There, my view is that, first of all, India's making one mistake. Mistake is the wrong word because it's something that has happened inadvertently and slowly. India had invested very well in not basic education, but higher education for an emerging economy. In the 60s and 70s, India really stood out as a big investment in higher education, and India did well by that. That is dropping off a little bit. We need to pay greater attention, make it much more widespread so that the global enrollment ratio goes up. It's now at 17% or so, which is just shockingly low. You want to draw more people into this. Also, India does very poorly on skilled education. This is where you need a little bit of public-private partnership to do better on that, because skilled education, if you leave it entirely to the private sector, here is the problem. You recruit someone with no skills into your company, spend the first 6 months, you spend money, get this person skilled up. Then this person becomes mobile, and the person will bid and there's a large proportion of them you will lose out. So you do not capture the benefits of the skill that you generate. The private sector does not fully capture. So the skill generation exercise needs the state to come in, because you need a little bit of taxpayer money to get the skills into place, because the private sector, the externalities are so bad, so big that it will not happen. So a couple of these interventions are needed to not stop the boom that you've seen at the top end of the skilled market, but to get the rest to catch up.
Jochen Weber, I work in psychology. First of all, thanks very much for the talk. I was wondering, in the overlap between governance and policymaking, to what extent you believe that one issue that should be addressed is educating people about the effects of policies, in particular because you also mentioned the debate about the debt of the United States possible, that once a topic becomes very emotional, and with your tax model, clearly somebody has to give up income for the benefit of others. To what extent do you think that unless there's a good means to actually educating people that they should accept certain policies as valid, that you actually will never be able to get them into effect?
Yeah, I've seen this firsthand, because when you take some tricky economic policy decision, very often from rich countries, the view used to be that you need to teach the politicians and the policymakers good economic policy. But sitting in Delhi, I realized, for which I didn't have to just sit in Delhi, and now I go to other places, going to Dakar, Senegal. When you meet with the top policymakers, when you meet with the finance ministers, the basic wisdom of what is today the current state of knowledge is there. they are all educated, first of all, in the same places. So it is a bit of a family. The problem arises when you try to take this policy out to the larger masses and win over, which any politician, especially in a democratic system where you're watching what will happen in the next election is crucial, that becomes a stumbling block. Examples. You're trying to raise fuel price, petrol price, which is in many countries massively subsidized. I think most top policymakers understand, there may be a few who don't, that you can't continue to do that because subsidizing this means on the face of it, it looks very good for the people, you're getting it at a lower price, but someone is paying the price and you are using the government's money to do that, which means you're diverting money from other expenditures into this and you're over consuming on this particular product. But the mass opinion on these are very often very weak, and I've been in situations where the argument would be that it's all very good, but as soon as we announce it, there's going to be a truckers' strike all over the country. Who's going to handle that strike? And a policy, can't undertake that policy because of that. If there was a better understanding of basic policies, I feel a lot of this would be helped because politicians respond to popular opinions, and if the popular opinion could be changed. So to that extent, having come into academics, having come into policy, I've become even more convinced about John Maynard Keynes's famous observation, where he says that in the long run, it's ideas which make a bigger difference than vested interests. When I had first read that, it's a very beautiful, lyrically written line in the last chapter of the General Theory by Keynes. When, as a professor, I used to read that line by Keynes saying that ideas are more important than vested interests, I liked it only because it was self-serving. It helped me as a professor to make the case for what I was doing. But having gone into the world of policy, actually I appreciate it even more, completely convinced. Vested interests, you can fight. But when an idea gets ingrained in a large mass of people's heads, it's very, very difficult to change that. And that becomes the bigger stumbling block. And so we need to work on that.
Hello, sir. I'm Masood, SIPA graduate student. My question is that in past 2 or 3 decades, we have seen that poverty has significantly come down to around 18 to 20%, and mainly because of improvements in China and India, which makes a large chunk of the world population. We also know that the main driving forces behind these changes in poverty was the investments, cheap labor, and reforms in these countries and all. But the World Bank has also been working in sub-Saharan Africa and other countries. In this scenario, how do I satisfy myself and a common man that a multilateral institution like World Bank, which is using a lot of resources, they are actually behind, they have some significant role to play in this poverty reduction, and they're not just a research institution telling us that the poverty rate is going down. So any concrete examples related to that? Thank you.
Yeah, all of you are making it harder by throwing in the word concrete every time. Examples are easier to give. Yes. First of all, on overall trends, let me tell you, by the way, over the last 10 years, sub-Saharan Africa is also, poverty is going down very, very rapidly. Before that, from about 1980, China, even before 1980, Chinese poverty was declining. India joined the bandwagon around 1993, 1994. India's poverty started declining. But over the last 10, 15 years, actually, it is even in sub-Saharan Africa, it's falling. There's a bit of a worry because over the last 1 year, as you know, there's bad news beginning to come out from one emerging economy after another. Brazilian growth is now less than 2%, so you may get some exacerbation of problems in some of these countries. But the World Bank, I think you will see actually a more energized World Bank with these new targets, with some of the reforms that are taking place within the World Bank in terms of just the structure of the World Bank and how quickly we respond. The science of delivery that we talked about, no matter what you call that, is precisely that. The World Bank used to be too slow in the past in responding. It is a bureaucracy, I should tell you. It's a large bureaucracy. It takes time. But there is an internal awareness now that needs to improve, and we have to respond to demand faster. And even in, I think, the scientific thinking of how you battle poverty, there is a shift that is taking place in the World Bank for the better. It's a richer view of the global economy, which you're beginning to see in the World Bank. So all these hopefully will be reflected in the policy that we will have on the ground.
Yes.
Okay, we'll take 2 more questions and then we'll...
Yannis Ziligakis from the Henry George School of Social Science. Henry George wrote in 1879 a remarkable book, which is, I think it was second to the Bible on sales at that time, called Progress and Poverty, examining exactly that same issue. Are you aware of him?
Aware of him, but I haven't read the book. Very much aware of him.
You should. Henry
I
George,
will add that,
Joe Stiglitz, in his recent book, copied George. So there, the concept of rent-seeking is identified as the source of extreme poverty, which also now it's a virus that's afflicting developed countries. You focus on the developing world, which is very commendable, but now that virus is starting inflicting developed countries. Europe, United States. I mean, New York City is a prime example of that, with homelessness going up, yet the rents keep going up. So any attempts on how to solve that problem? Taxation could be a solution? And just to illustrate with a very small example, if I was able to claim rights to the air in this room, I could all charge you for breathing. I would be super rich, you would be super poor. And that's what's happening today in our economy. And how do we solve that? Thank you.
I will, from a very different, thank you very much for not asking for a concrete example, but I will still give you one from a very different domain. What you say actually is right, because what constitutes a property with a right has an element of fuzziness to that. And the first people who get onto this usually tend to get a bigger benefit. There is a very beautiful book by the historian Stuart Banner called How the Indians Lost Their Land. This is talking about the Americas. And this book is not a radical book at all, but it gives you great insights. When you are doing trade with a group of people who don't think of land as a category of transaction, they will make mistake after mistake in these contracts that they are signing. And you see this in today's world. I mean, financial products are very difficult to understand for most people. It's almost like the natives trying to understand land as a product which you can sell or buy. They never thought of land along those lines. A lot of financial products have that side to it. And it is indeed true that there is a lot of rent-seeking activity just because people are falling into contracts which they don't even quite understand what they are signing onto. Stuart Banner's book has beautiful examples of both sides are coming with different categories into the marketplace, and there are disastrous contracts being signed. I feel this is happening today in other areas, but do I have a solution? The answer, unfortunately, is nothing immediate, because you don't want to use ham-handed government law to just stop a lot of new products being created, new forms of transactions. That's the way the world grows. You want to encourage that. At the same time, you have to be mindful of the changing structure and bring in changing laws. And in the world of finance, this is very important. In today's world of finance, because there are newer products coming in, so the law has to be forever on the watch for a new product where you come in and you try to create a new wall against this being exploited. But there will be no ultimate solution, because people will keep discovering new products, some of which are worthwhile, you want them in the marketplace, some of which are exploitative mechanisms for exploitation. The law has to be forever vigilant on this. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Henry Nass, I'm on the west side. I live on the west side. Actually, this is not about policy. It is about your reading. And what I want to know is, was there ever a period when you read much science fiction or utopia and dystopia novels? And if so, can you give me some concrete examples?
No, my childhood was spent on reading three kinds of things, which is detective novels a lot, plays a lot, and humor a lot, but not science fiction. So I can't give you examples.
Well, on that cosmic note, why don't we stop the formal part? Thank Kaushik, and there is refreshments, reception to celebrate the launching of the new center and Kaushik Basu's visit at Columbia.